Hi everybody, thanks for having me. I'd like to start this presentation by returning to a terrible moment of the COVID-19 pandemic in which an estimated 18.2 million humans died. We often remember COVID-19 as largely a human event, a result of globalization, unequal healthcare, neoliberal policies, and more. However, this narration belies a much more widespread ecological truth. Many species, though none perhaps as much as mink, were infected with and dying because of COVID-19. Mink fur farms provided the virus with myriad of opportunities to pass from infected laborers to tens, if not hundreds of thousands of densely housed mink. Epidemiologists raised particularly urgent alarm bells, stating that an equivalent laboratory experiment would be classified as gain-of-function research and therefore prohibited. Gain-of-function research is research that involves modifying the genetics of an organism, like a virus or bacteria, to increase its biological functions, in this case becoming more virulent. Their concern lay in a biochemical similarity between humans and minks, as well as ferrets, as well as ferrets. This biochemical kinship between humans and minks, as well as ferrets, is the entry point for this research. Humans, minks, and ferrets share similar sialic acids, a family of 9 carbonacetic acid sugars found at the outermost ends of sugar chains on glycoproteins. This means that the dock the virus is confined to is structurally quite similar between humans, minks, and ferrets. Ferrets and mink are more similar to humans in this regard than other common lab animals, like mice or livestock, often associated with zoonotic events, like pigs, who have been linked to human influenza and even Ebola events. This biochemical similarity binds humans, mink, and ferrets' fates in complex ways during periods of outbreak, involving a myriad of viruses listed in the table above, most notably corona and influenza viruses. In some very particular biochemical sense, these sciences reveal a relatedness that, per the COVID-19 outbreaks, have important broader health implications. However, these scientific understandings of relatedness do not translate directly to bonds of kinship, or the construction of more than human health coalitions. For ferrets, I forgot about animations. For ferrets, scientific discovery seems to both understand, uncover, study, and describe this quality of relatedness as a point of extraction. Ferrets become stand-ins for humans in research to improve human biomedical advances to better model human viral infections. The very virus that was infecting humans and minks at fur farms across the globe was also being intentionally used to infect and study ferrets in laboratories across China, the United States, Canada, and Europe. As Zhao and their team succinctly stated, the features of SARS-CoV-2 replication and pathogenesis in ferrets make them an ideal candidate animal model for evaluating the efficacy of antiviral drugs or vaccines against COVID-19. Feminist political economy perhaps gives us partial insights into how ferrets' relatedness can be objectified within the laboratory. Speaking to the ways in which capitalism orients society to more than human life, Rosemary Claire Collard and Jessica Dempsey present a schematic, including 5 ways that natures are oriented to capital. Collard and Dempsey define the first category, the officially valued, as all entities and energies that capitalism officially recognizes as means or mode, as means of or product of production. Laboratory animals have been theorized as some by laborers, though I would argue in this case that ferrets instead become a biotechnology, which is defined by Jasanoff are not merely physical artifacts, but socially and materially stabilized heterogeneous networks of actors, institutions, norms, discourses, and non-human elements. In either case, whether classified as labor or technology, lab-infected ferrets become a means of production for scientific knowledge, which is commodified through publication, patents, pharmaceutical development, and more. In contrast, Collard and Dempsey define another category, the threat, as certain bodies or natures that are deemed a threat to capitalist production or to certain human populations. These threats, like the mink, become the focal points for biosecurity techniques, practices, and investments, just as the farmed mink were. In Denmark, for example, over 17 million mink were culled over just 5 days. The zoonotic threat was purportedly eliminated. To understand the discordant ways in which science understands a single biochemical similarity, I put forward the term selective relationality. Selective relationality helps us to understand how science both helps to uncover new forms of relatedness not previously understood through Darwinian evolutionary theory, and yet also makes selective and partial meaning of this relationality. To further expand upon this concept of selective relationality, I want to begin first with the concept by which scientists and state actors alike understand human and animal health as interrelated: zoonosis. While strictly defined as the process by which animals can pass diseases along to humans, my research understands zoonosis as a shifting concept that includes not only a collection of diverse biological processes, but also a set of political economic anxieties that can be traced back to 19th century Germany. Rudolf Virchow, pictured here, a pathologist, medical expert, politician, anthropologist, and public health activist, a man of many hats, was the first to name the transfer of pathogens between animal and human, coining the term zoonosis. Highlighting the role of animals in disease processes served a political purpose for Virchow, who was concerned that germ theory, which was quickly gaining popularity due to Louis Pasteur, would mark humans, and specifically lower classes, as reservoirs of disease that needed to be avoided to maintain health. By highlighting instead the infectious nature of animal populations, the concept of zoonosis holds within it a noble attempt to ameliorate human social difference while reproducing the animal other. Zoonosis both highlights the interrelatedness of human and more than human health, while also marking animals as bodies to be disciplined, studied, and commodified for the sake of human public health ventures. Scientists' understanding of ferrets' selective relationality begins with zoonosis, but also with the rise of comparative medicine and the use of model organisms. While ancient Greeks are the first to have studied animal bodies as a means for understanding human anatomy, animal study rose in prominence alongside surgical developments, germ theory, and related drug developments of the late 19th and 20th centuries. August Crowe, the 1920 winner of the Nobel Peace Prize in Physiology and Medicine, declared confidently that for a large number of problems, there will be some animal of choice or a few such animals on which it can be conveniently studied. Crowe furthered his position with an anecdote. Many years ago, my teacher was interested in the respiratory mechanism of the lung, and while devising the method of studying the exchange through each lung separately, he found that a certain kind of tortoise possessed a trachea dividing into the main bronchi high up in the neck. And we used to say as a laboratory joke that this animal had been created expressly for the purposes of respiration physiology. I have no doubt that there's quite a number of animals which are similarly created for special physiological purposes, but I'm afraid that most of them are unknown to the men for whom they were created, and we must apply to the zoologist to find them and lay our hands on them. Crowe's position reflects the ontological assumptions behind much of animal laboratory testing. Animals' value is in their utility to scientific progress. Just 4 years later, Wilson Smith would be the first to isolate a viral sample of influenza. While his published articles describes his attempts to test and infect a great many different lab animals with the viral sample, ferrets were the only ones to demonstrate obvious flu symptoms. Wilson Smith and his colleagues would later develop one of the first vaccines to inoculate against influenza. This photo from London's Picture Post magazine, published in 1946, describes the ferret sneeze that echoed around the world. While viral vaccines would go on to save untold human lives, these technologies were also built upon a presumption of human life as separate, distinct, and securable from the natural world. The many histories of these technologies often ignore the fact that while working in the lab, both Wilson Smith and one of his lab mates got sick from influenza-infected ferrets. Just a decade after Wilson Smith would develop his vaccine after getting infected multiple times, GIs would come home to places like Canada and the United States and start mink fur farms. Mink, seen as a fur commodity rather than a health technology, were being bred not as laboratory devices, but rather for specific genetics related to fur commodification, selected for a larger size, softer fur, more docile temperaments, and specific pelt colors. In 1966, mink fur farming would hit its peak in the United States, with over 6,000 farmers of mink producing over 6.2 million pelts annually. While technologies like the influenza vaccine flowed smoothly from the laboratory, information about the relatedness of ferrets, minks, and humans, or the transmissibility of viral diseases between species, appeared stymied. Feminist science studies scholar Hannah Landecker encourages us to consider the biologies of our history, how human historical events and processes have materialized as biological events, processes, and ecologies. This photo, portraying a mink culling event during COVID-19, depicts a biology of our history, the consequence of imagining our health to be distinct from the animals we produced so densely alongside us. Selective relationality helps us understand these parallel tracks by which science codes ferrets as useful and commodifiable in the pursuit of scientific knowledge, and minks as initially commodifiable but then ultimately existential threat. This concept builds not only on feminist political economy work like the previously mentioned analysis from Dempsey and Collard, but also scholars of racial capitalism. Melamed, in her now seminal essay on racial capitalism, argues that accumulation is produced through social separateness, or anti-relationality. Melamed's work builds on Ruth Wilson Gilmore's analysis, which understands racial capitalism as a technology of anti-relationality. Following Gilmore, racism is the state-sanctioned and/or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death in distinct yet densely interconnected political geographies. Melamed argues that this last part of Gilmore's definition is seldom quoted, but yet crucially it identifies a dialectic in which forms of humanity are separated so that they may be interconnected in terms that feed capital. Gilmore elsewhere names this process partition and identifies it as the base algorithm for capitalism, which develops according to its capacity to control who can relate and under what terms. Melamed argues the disjoining or deactivating of relationships between human beings and humans in nature is needed for capitalist expropriation to work. The critical differentiating technologies of race and species are used to legitimate low-paid or enslaved labor that during COVID-19 subjected frontline and essential workers to higher rates of infection and death, and laboratory animals as disposable tools for commodifiable scientific knowledge. While both feminist political economy and racial capitalism theory can explain our end result, by which animal and racialized bodies become a technology for capitalist accumulation, neither fully account for the nuances by which science itself leads us to this point. Both prior theories take capitalism as central studies of object. While these scholarships are critically important, they also elide the critical steps in which scientific knowledge is produced under presumed objectivity, above the reproach of both economic and social dynamics within society, and yet further reifies logics of extraction. Following in the tradition of feminist science studies, my research attempts to understand the divergent scientific understandings that literature has come to about mink and ferrets as not purely a result of capitalism, but also as a product of assumed objectivity within white and patriarchal spaces, and as the result of the imaginary of the laboratory and the promises it makes about securing life in partial and selective ways. Thank you.